She saw everyone ignore the mafia boss' blind son, until she asked him to dance. The crystal glasses clinked like wind chimes as Natalia Bassi maneuvered her tray through the crowd, her eyes scanning the room for anyone in need of a drink. The ballroom of the Harbor City Grand Hotel glittered under 1,000 chandeliers, rich laughter echoing in the air. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and $100 cologne, a suffocating perfume of wealth. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're watching from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now, let's continue. Natalia had become accustomed to the invisibility that came with her job. She was a waitress, a fixture in the background of other people's glamorous lives. Her days consisted of serving drinks and clearing tables, blending into the tapestry of the elite without ever becoming part of the thread. She moved with the practiced, minimal gestures of someone who needed to avoid attention while remaining perfectly efficient. Tonight was the annual Harbor City Children's Health Gala, a night where the city's most powerful gathered to signal their virtue and finalize their deals, all while pretending to care about pediatric oncology. She carefully edged around a cluster of women whose gowns looked like they cost more than her annual rent. "Another champagne, darling, and please be quick about it." The demand came from a tall man with a silver watch that glinted under the lights. Natalia nodded, managing a small, practiced smile that never quite reached her tired eyes. Her own thoughts were centered on the clock, on the meager tips that would determine if she could pay the late fee on her utility bill, and on the memory of the worn key in her pocket, the key to her studio apartment that felt miles away from this absurd, glittering spectacle. As she navigated the perimeter, following the wall to reach the service doors, she spotted him. He was seated at a small decorative table, tucked almost behind a velvet curtain, a position clearly chosen for its obscurity. He was a young boy, no older than 10, dressed impeccably in a suit so tailored it looked liquid. His posture was too perfect, his small body too still. While children in other parts of the room chased each other or played on their phones, he sat motionless, a figure carved from marble. But it was his eyes that pulled Natalia up short. They were a deep, beautiful brown, but utterly blank, clouded with a soft, milky opacity. He wasn't looking at the crowd or the lights. He was simply looking nowhere. Samuel Zane, Natalia realized later, was a boy who was seen by everyone, but never truly seen. She slowed her pace, fighting the professional impulse to hurry past. The boy's solitude was palpable, a dense pocket of quiet desperation in the heart of the noisy room. Natalia noticed that the other guests, even those seated at tables nearby, treated his space like an exclusion zone. No one spoke to him. No one offered him a glass of water. They looked through him, around him, as if he were an oddly expensive piece of background furniture. A ripple of silence, colder and sharper than the ambient chatter, began to spread through the ballroom. Natalia knew that silence. It was the sound of true power entering a space. She quickly scanned the room until she found the source. He was unmistakable, even for someone who had never seen him in person. Adrian Zane. He was the kind of man whose presence consumed light and demanded attention. He was built with a menacing sort of elegance, wearing a suit that looked less like clothing and more like a second skin of power. His movements were slow, deliberate, and terrifyingly efficient. Flanked by two men who moved with the coiled readiness of trained security, he made his way toward the boys' corner. Adrian Zane was not just wealthy, he was the notorious heart of Harbor City's darkest operations. The papers called him a philanthropist. The police called him untouchable. Everyone else whispered his name with a mix of abject fear and grudging respect. He was the mafia boss, the sovereign of the city's unseen underworld. Natalia watched as the behemoth of a man reached the table. The crowd held its collective breath. Adrian Zane looked down at his son, and for the briefest moment, the stone-cold facade cracked. It was a flicker of something deep, protective, and terribly isolated. He placed a hand lightly on Samuel's shoulder, leaned down and spoke a few words that were swallowed by the surrounding music. Samuel nodded once, still looking at nothing. The interaction was brief. Adrian Zane straightened and immediately returned to his duties, pulling the focus of the room back to his commanding presence. But what followed cemented Natalia's growing unease. A society woman, dripping in diamonds and confidence, approached Adrian Zane to exchange pleasantries. Her gaze, however, lingered on Samuel, and she leaned in to whisper something to Adrian. Whatever she said, it was meant to be discreet, but the reaction it provoked was not. Adrian Zane's eyes narrowed, his face hardening instantly. The woman's smile dissolved, and she backed away with an apology that sounded weak and hollow. The message was clear. Adrian Zane was to be feared, but his son was an inconvenience, even a liability to be ignored. The sheer indifference toward the child, coupled with the palpable fear directed at his father, stoked a quiet, fierce defiance in Natalia. She remembered the dismissive way the society woman had treated her moments earlier, the way she was constantly looked through. She saw herself reflected in the boy's exclusion, intensified tenfold by his disability and his father's dangerous reputation. Children should never be invisible. The thought was a sharp, unbidden command. She looked at her tray of half-finished cocktails. She looked at her supervisor, Marcos, who was nowhere in sight. She looked at the polished marble floor and the reflection of the chandeliers above, and knew that stepping out of her role, breaking the spell of her invisibility, was the most reckless thing she could do. It was unprofessional, potentially grounds for immediate termination, and, given the boy's father, possibly dangerous. Yet she couldn't shake the pull to offer him the one thing everyone else had denied him: attention. The orchestra transitioned into a softer melody, a gentle, sweeping waltz. On the main floor, couples began to move, but the children, for once, were largely absent, leaving the space open. Natalia set her tray down on an empty buffet stand with deliberate care, smoothing the front of her uniform. She took a deep breath, the scent of expensive perfume giving way to the metallic tang of her own fear, and walked directly toward the secluded table. Adrian Zane was across the room, engrossed in a quiet, intense discussion with two men in matching dark suits. He was facing away from her. The boy, Samuel, was running a careful finger along the edge of the tablecloth, his head tilted as if listening to a silent frequency. Natalia knelt beside his chair, bringing herself down to his level, invading the space everyone else respected as untouchable. "Hi there," she said softly, her voice pitched low to avoid startling him. "My name is Natalia. I work here tonight." Samuel's head turned slightly toward the sound, a careful, assessing movement. His brow furrowed in a slight expression of concentration, as if he were trying to place the unfamiliar voice. "I'm Samuel," he replied, his voice small but perfectly articulate. "It's a lovely party," Natalia said, deciding to proceed with gentle normality. "But it looks like a lot of people are dancing now." She held out her hand, palm up, just below his sightline. "Would you like to dance? I can show you how." The silence that followed stretched thin, humming with possibility. Samuel didn't immediately take her hand. He tilted his head, seemingly listening to the rustle of the velvet curtains, and the muted throb of the bass from the orchestra. Natalia held her breath, prepared for a gentle rejection. It was a strange request from a strange person after all. Finally, with a hesitant, almost fragile movement, Samuel reached out. His fingers, cool and delicate, brushed against hers. "Yes," he said simply. "I think I would like that." She helped him down from the chair. He was slight for his age, and she felt the small, almost imperceptible tremor of his uncertainty as his feet found the floor. Natalia gently led him out of the shadows and toward the very edge of the dance floor, away from the swirling couples. "We can start here," she whispered, "where we have lots of space." She took both his hands in hers and placed her feet carefully, allowing him to step onto her pumps. It was a familiar, comforting dance hold, one her own mother had taught her. "Now we just sway a little," she instructed, initiating the gentle movement. "Feel the rhythm of the music. It tells you when to move." To her surprise, Samuel was instantly receptive. His body, which had been so rigidly held in the chair, began to loosen. He followed her movements with an intuitive grace that was astonishing. "You're a wonderful dancer," Natalia murmured, genuinely impressed. "It's like walking, but slower," Samuel stated. He didn't smile, but his expression lost the anxious concentration it had held at the table. He was present in the moment. For a brief, suspended span of time, it was just the two of them. A waitress in a cheap black uniform and a blind boy in an expensive gray suit, swaying gently at the edge of a sea of indifferent wealth. The connection felt rare and precious, a private moment snatched from the cold vastness of the ballroom. Natalia found herself smiling, the fatigue forgotten. This felt more purposeful than any service she had provided all night. Then the song began to fade, drifting to its final chords. The gentle, shared magic began to dissolve, replaced by a sudden, jarring awareness of the room. The music stopped entirely, but the silence that followed was unnaturally absolute. Conversations had not resumed. Laughter was absent. The 1,000 glittering lights suddenly felt like 1,000 pairs of eyes. Natalia looked up, following the direction of the crowd's arrested gaze, and her heart seized in her chest. Adrian Zane was no longer across the room. He stood just 10 feet away, flanked by his men, having finished his discussion at some point during their dance. He was not moving, but his entire focus was fixed on her and his son. His dark eyes, bottomless and terrifying, met hers across the small stretch of polished wood. His expression was utterly unreadable. No anger, no amusement, no discernible emotion at all, just a calculating, intense scrutiny that felt like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders. Natalia felt the immediate, chilling realization of the invisible boundary she had crossed. This was not just a moment of kindness. This was a deliberate intrusion into the life of the most powerful and dangerous man in Harbor City. Her simple, unexpected act of kindness had cost her her invisibility. She had placed herself squarely in Adrian Zane's dangerous line of sight, and she had no idea what would happen next. The air in the Harbor City Grand was thick with the scent of fear, though the guests mistook it for expensive cologne. Natalia, a waitress trained in the art of blending in, knew the difference. Fear had a metallic edge, and it sharpened whenever the city's unseen lord, Adrian Zane, was in the room. Natalia didn't fear him. Not yet. Her worries were strictly financial. But as she saw his small, isolated son sitting in the corner, a vulnerable shadow of the Zane legacy, she realized that a simple act of attention might be the fastest way to attract the monster's notice. The silence that had fallen after the final chord of the waltz felt less like respect for the music and more like a collective freeze in the presence of a predator. Natalia and Samuel stood at the edge of the dance floor, and the only movement in the room was Adrian Zane's purposeful stride. Adrian didn't walk. He glided, the human currents of the ballroom parting around him as if he were cutting through water. His two bodyguards followed, their faces sculpted in identical expressions of lethal boredom. As he closed the distance, Samuel finally spoke, pulling his hands from Natalia's to give a small, formal bow in the direction of his father's imposing presence. "Thank you for the dance, Natalia," Samuel said, his voice bright and unaffected by the surrounding tension. "I will record it in my journal as the first successful waltz." "It was my pleasure, Samuel," Natalia replied, trying to match his composure. Her heart, however, was trying to stage a frantic escape through her throat. She could smell the expensive leather of Adrian Zane's shoes, the sharpness of his cologne, and beneath it something cold and dangerous that didn't belong in a luxury hotel. Adrian stopped directly in front of them, his great height forcing Natalia to crane her neck. His dark eyes, which had looked bottomless from across the room, now felt like two perfectly calibrated instruments of interrogation. "You are Natalia," he stated, the word deep, accented, and utterly devoid of question. "Yes, sir," she answered automatically, snapping back into her service persona. "I can refill your water, or perhaps bring you a fresh linen napkin?" Adrian's intense expression wavered, replaced by something close to confusion. One of his bodyguards shifted slightly, stifling a cough that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle. "I do not require linens," Adrian said, his voice flat. He looked down at Samuel, who was now carefully dusting an invisible speck from his tailored trousers. "Did you enjoy the activity, Samuel?" "Yes, Father." Natalia established a satisfactory counting rhythm, and she did not treat my participation as a nuisance, which is the customary reaction of your associates. The blunt, innocent truth of Samuel's statement made the muscles in Adrian's jaw clench. He looked back at Natalia, the cold intensity returning tenfold. "Miss Natalia," he said, pulling a leather wallet from his inner jacket pocket, a wallet that probably contained more cash than her entire checking account. "Your attention to my son was unexpected. It is not often he is shown such consideration. I would like to compensate you for your time." He cleanly peeled off a stack of crisp $100 bills, folded once. It was a thick bundle, easily over $2,000. He held it out to her like he was handing a paperclip. Natalia's brain, already fried from a double shift and 2 hours of dodging drunken executives, short-circuited entirely. Her tired, practical mind registered the massive sum, then the implication. She was being tipped for being human. It felt utterly bizarre. "Oh, sir, no, please," Natalia stammered, holding up her hands. "I appreciate the generosity, truly, but I can't accept that." Adrian Zane froze, the money suspended mid-air between them. The two bodyguards exchanged a silent, stunned glance. Even Samuel stopped smoothing his trousers. "You decline," Adrian repeated, articulating each syllable slowly, as if translating an alien language. "Yes, sir," Natalia said, her polite service smile straining to stay in place. "It was just a dance. That's far too much for one dance. If you'd like to add a tip to my service charge, the standard 20% would be lovely. But I genuinely enjoyed dancing with Samuel." "You can't put a price on kindness, you know." "You can't put a price on kindness." The words sounded ludicrous even to her own ears, especially when spoken to a man who probably priced human lives by the square foot. Adrian Zane stared at her for a long, unsettling moment. His gaze seemed to bore right through her polyester uniform, past her rent worries, and straight into the core of her defiant exhaustion. Natalia felt a sudden wave of heat, realizing her refusal, born of principle and sheer fatigue, had just insulted the most powerful man in the city. Adrian slowly lowered his hand, slipping the money back into his pocket without breaking eye contact. "A price is placed on everything, Miss Natalia. Always. But I respect your unusual discretion." He paused, a corner of his mouth twitching, barely enough to qualify as a non-smile. "However, I did not introduce myself. My name is Adrian Zane." The air pressure in the room seemed to drop, and the glittering ballroom suddenly felt very small. Natalia had known who he was in the abstract, the monster, the criminal, the name whispered in fear. But hearing it spoken, in that low, commanding voice, felt like the final click of a lock. The waitress who needed to pay rent had just refused a tip from Harbor City's mafia boss. Great, Natalia thought internally, her professional smile finally collapsing. I'm definitely getting fired now. I hope Marcos at least pays me for the hours I already worked. Adrian watched her face, perhaps waiting for the expected reaction of terror or awe. He saw only profound, tired irritation. "Samuel requires more than one dance," Adrian continued, completely ignoring the stunned silence. "He needs consistent companionship, structure, and someone who, apparently, is not susceptible to a cash offer for simple interaction." He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate murmur that only she could hear. "You have a perspective on Samuel that is rare. Most people here see a disability and a liability. You saw only a boy. I need you to continue seeing him, not just for a waltz at a party, but regularly." He straightened, his expression serious. "I am offering you a position, Natalia, not a service job. You will be Samuel's companion. You will set your own schedule within reason, and your salary will be commensurate with the importance of my son's welfare. Consider the $2,000 I offered you for the dance as a starting bonus for the first week alone." Adrian's offer was delivered with the same unyielding certainty with which he commanded the room, a unique opportunity that promised financial security she couldn't dream of, but tethered her to a world she knew was poisonous. Natalia stared at him, caught between the terrifying realization of who he was and the dizzying promise of a life where she didn't have to worry about the utility bill. Her mind raced, calculating, companion, bodyguard, prisoner. "Mr. Zane," Natalia managed, gripping her hands tightly. "With all due respect, I am a waitress. I have no qualifications for companion to the Zane family." Adrian's gaze softened just slightly, an expression that was more assessing than warm. "Your qualification is simple. You asked him to dance when no one else would. That is enough. Consider the offer, Natalia. I will be in contact." With that, Adrian placed his hand firmly on Samuel's shoulder, a gesture that was both protective and possessive. He guided his son away, melting back into the crowd that now opened instantly for him. Samuel looked back over his shoulder, a small, curious tilt to his head, before disappearing completely. Natalia stood alone on the polished marble floor, the silence of the room screaming around her. She was acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes now burning holes into her back, and she realized the gravity of her decision. What began as an innocent dance now felt like the first move in a game she was not equipped to play. Her simple act of kindness had just delivered her directly into the hands of the mafia boss. She needed to get back to the kitchen, clock out, and get home to her daughter. But first she had to find her tray. Natalia found her tray right where she had left it, sitting on the buffet stand beside a melting ice sculpture of a swan. She snatched it up, the weight of the silver tray suddenly feeling insignificant compared to the invisible, suffocating weight Adrian Zane's gaze had left on her. She retreated to the safety of the kitchen, the cacophony of clattering dishes and shouted orders providing a small measure of anonymity. "Where were you?" Marcos, her supervisor, materialized in front of her, his clipboard a shield against the chaos. His usually pale face was flushed with frantic color. "I told you table 6 needed fresh napkins 10 minutes ago. And why were you talking to the Zane table? Do you have a death wish?" "Bassie?" Natalia dumped the empty glasses into a bin. "I was just being polite, Marcos. I was helping the boy. He was alone." Marcos leaned closer, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that still failed to conceal his terror. "That is Adrian Zane's table. You do not speak to Adrian Zane's table unless they ask for a 3rd bottle of the 70-year-old single malt. You especially do not touch the little prince. He is not like the other children. He is protected. I was ready to call the hospital wing and apologize preemptively for your inevitable disappearance." "He just wanted to dance," Natalia sighed, wiping down the tray. "And you just landed yourself in the middle of a territorial dispute," Marcos hissed. "Go, finish your shift, and if you see Mr. Zane again, look straight ahead and pretend you are a very expensive potted plant." Natalia finished her shift in a state of wired exhaustion, managing to avoid every dark suit in the room. She was so focused on keeping her head down that she almost missed the small, folded piece of thick cardstock tucked under the clock-out receipt. It was Adrian Zane's business card. It was not the flimsy type lawyers handed out. It felt like compressed stone, edged in silver, with nothing on it but his name, a private number, and a single precise address, the Anchor Estate. Natalia felt a cold flutter of dread. The Anchor Estate. That was the name of the monolithic, impossible mansion built on the most inaccessible point of Harbor City's cliffside, overlooking the entire bay. It was less a home and more a fortress. She crumpled the card slightly, then smoothed it out. $2,000 for one dance. That money could pay for Tulip's preschool application, 3 months of utilities, and maybe even a weekend trip to the beach they had never been able to afford. The temptation, the sheer blinding practicality of that kind of money, was a physical ache. "Mommy, look at this boat," Tulip said on Sunday afternoon, pointing to a magazine ad. "It's like a white castle on the water." The White Castle was the Anchor Estate. It was prominently featured in a luxury magazine, a sprawling fortress of glass and steel. "That's a very big house, sweetie," Natalia said, pulling the magazine away. "Imagine having that much space," her mother Eleanor mused later that evening, sipping coffee in Natalia's small kitchen. "It's obscene, isn't it? That kind of power. It's a safe life," Natalia whispered, looking at the stone-like business card on the counter. "He wants me to teach his son, that's all. I am good at teaching." "You are great at caring, which is why they want you," Eleanor corrected, placing her cup down. "But Natalia, this is Adrian Zane. He sells protection, which means he is in the business of terror. You take this job, you don't just get a salary, you get a family, a very, very bad family." Natalia knew her mother was right. She could not sell her life, not even for Tulip's sake. She had to walk away. She composed an email. "Mr. Zane, I appreciate your incredible offer, but I must respectfully decline. I am not suitable for the role." She hovered over the send button for 10 minutes. Her gaze drifted to the frayed edge of the kitchen counter, the peeling linoleum, the stacked bill envelopes that still needed attention. Then she thought of Samuel, alone in that vast ballroom, perfectly ignored, and the quiet joy when he counted. 1, 2, 3. She closed the email without sending it. She woke up Monday morning with the decision still a heavy, impossible weight. The phone rang at 9:00 a.m., the private number. Natalia Bassi. Adrian's deep voice resonated without preamble. You did not respond to the offer. This is not a situation that accommodates indecision. Mr. Zane, I was just drafting my response. I have serious moral concerns about the environment this job entails, Natalia said, trying to sound professional and brave, even though her knees were shaking. I have a daughter, and I cannot jeopardize her safety by becoming involved with my associates. Adrian finished smoothly. I understand your concern, which is why I will provide a separate contract detailing specific security provisions for your daughter, a non-negotiable term. And you are not becoming involved with my associates, Natalia. You are becoming involved with my son. They are not the same thing. They are separated by a gulf of my protection. He paused, the silence more compelling than any threat. However, you are right. This cannot be discussed via email. I am insisting on a meeting. I want you to see the environment before you make a final decision. I will send a car for you at 5:00 p.m. today. It is not a request, Natalia. It is an acknowledgement that your concerns are legitimate, and they can only be addressed in person. Do not refuse this courtesy. I am not paying you to fear me. I am paying you to care for my son. His invitation was direct and unyielding, leaving her with absolutely no room to refuse. Natalia swallowed, the metallic taste of fear sharp in her mouth. She knew what this was. The mafia boss was inviting her to his fortress for an audience, not a job interview. But she had crossed the line when she asked his son to dance. The reality of her decision settled on her. She was now in Adrian Zane's world, and she was already too deep to simply send a polite email declining his hospitality. I understand, Mr. Zane, Natalia said, the words barely a whisper. I will be ready at 5. Natalia stood on the curb of her small apartment building at 4:58 p.m., clutching a small worn handbag. She wore her best work clothes, a simple navy skirt and a button-down shirt, the closest she could get to professional attire without spending a week's wages. She felt hopelessly underdressed for whatever was about to happen. Her nerves were tight, wound up not by a fear of physical harm, but by the sheer, overwhelming dread of the immense, permanent decision she was about to make. The old life, the life of financial struggle and independence, was poised to end, and in its place was a gilded cage of security and obligation. Promptly at 5:00 p.m. a vehicle arrived. It was not a limousine, which would have been flashy, nor a beaten-up black sedan, which would have been stereotypical. It was a matte black, armored SUV, silent and imposing, looking like a tank designed by a luxury car company. It pulled up to the curb with an almost imperceptible glide, its windows deeply polarized, making the interior invisible. A man unfolded from the passenger seat. He was tall, dressed in a suit identical to Adrian Zane's bodyguards, but his eyes were gentler, and he carried himself with less aggressive intensity. He was simply enormous, built like a wall of muscle, but his movements were surprisingly graceful. Miss Bassi, the man said, his voice surprisingly soft. I am Andre. Mr. Zane sends his apologies for the lack of notice. He is eager to show you the facility. Andre opened the back door. The interior was cavernous, silent, and smelled faintly of expensive leather and ozone. Natalia slid onto the plush seat, feeling dwarfed by the sheer size of the vehicle. The door closed with a heavy final thunk that sealed her off from the familiar sounds of her neighborhood. The drive was surreal. They left the crowded, familiar streets of Harbor City and climbed the sheer cliff road toward the isolated private section of the coast. Andre navigated the ascent with the smooth, unhurried ease of a man completely at home in this environment. The SUV's specialized suspension devoured the uneven road, maintaining a silent, steady pace that felt more like flying than driving. As they ascended, Natalia watched her world shrink below. Her apartment building became a tiny gray block, the constant draining noise of the city muted to a distant thrum. The pollution, the traffic, and the frantic pace of the metropolis seemed to fall away, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of the ocean and pine. Andre spoke without turning his head, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the silent cabin. Mr. Zane selected this location for its natural isolation. It is an unassailable position. There are only two ways in or out, the service road we are on and the sea below. Both are monitored constantly. Natalia found her voice tight, a thin whisper in the vast space. You make it sound like a prison. It is a fortress, Miss Bassi. Protection and imprisonment often share the same architecture, Andre replied simply. He didn't offer judgment, only technical observation. Mr. Zane is rarely concerned with the comfort of his perimeter, only its efficacy. The perimeter is what keeps Samuel safe. That is the first thing you must understand. They reached the first checkpoint. It wasn't a gate, but a concrete archway where sensors and specialized cameras scanned the vehicle. The air hissed, a metallic sound. And a voice, piped through an external speaker, verified Andre's identity and mission before they moved on. Natalia counted 3 more such automated verifications before they reached the final entry point. It was a formidable gate of black iron, heavy enough to stop a freight train. The entire process of gaining entry felt less like driving home and more like docking a submarine. The gate finally slid open with a deep mechanical sigh, revealing the Anchor estate. The complex was breathtaking, a minimalist structure of dark glass and steel embedded into the cliff face, like a jewel set in granite. It was both beautiful and terrifyingly secure, designed to withstand the violent coastal storms, and Natalia realized the violent world Adrian Zane inhabited. The estate seemed to absorb sound. The wind and the waves suddenly muted as they drove onto the grounds. The design emphasized unbreachable privacy and staggering wealth. Andre parked near the main entrance, which was a vast, seamless sheet of obsidian glass. Mr. Zane is in the library. I will take you there. Inside, the silence was immediate and profound, broken only by the echo of their footsteps on the polished dark marble floors. The halls were pristine, lined with abstract art that favored sharp angles and somber colors. There were no family photos, no signs of lived-in warmth, only statements of untouchable power and staggering wealth. Every corner seemed to be watching, though the security cameras were subtly concealed and the lighting was ambient, never harsh. The entire complex felt less like a home and more like a high-end, high-security vault. As they walked, Natalia forced herself to maintain a professional demeanor, but her neck muscles were rigid. The staff here is minimal, Andre explained as they passed a set of gleaming steel service doors. Ms. Petrov, the head of house, runs the domestic side with absolute discretion. The rest are security personnel rotating in 3 shifts. You will not see or interact with them unless necessary. Silence and anonymity are the 2 core tenets of the Anchor estate. They reached the library. The room was set behind massive, heavy paneled doors that looked centuries old, a stark contrast to the modernist architecture surrounding it. Adrian Zane was waiting. The library was breathtaking. The walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, spanning what looked like thousands of volumes. But the dominant feature was one wall, entirely composed of reinforced glass, overlooking the wild, churning Pacific Ocean. The scene was cinematic, the immense, unforgiving sea stretching out to the horizon, visible proof of the estate's complete isolation. Adrian stood before it, silhouetted against the turbulent sea light. Natalia, Adrian said, turning to face her. He wore a simple black turtleneck and tailored trousers, managing to look both casual and infinitely more dangerous than he had in a tuxedo. Thank you for accepting my invitation. You are sensible, a quality I value highly. I didn't have much choice, Mr. Zane, Natalia replied, unable to keep the tired honesty out of her voice. When you know everything about me, choice becomes relative. Adrian gave the non-smile again. In my world, Natalia, choice is the only commodity that truly exists. Your choice to dance with Samuel was immense. Your choice to be here is simply practical. Sit down. He gestured to a chair opposite a huge polished desk made of a single slab of dark wood. He did not sit immediately, preferring to pace the length of the glass wall, the rhythmic movement making her already frayed nerves jump. I know your concerns are about my business, Adrian stated, stopping to look at the tempestuous sea. Let me be clear. You will never see my business. I employ people like you to create a vacuum of normalcy around my son. Your security is my responsibility. I pay people for silence. I pay you for sound, for interaction, for caring about a boy whom everyone else in this world dismisses as defective. Natalia felt a sting of pity, seeing the raw protectiveness he could not entirely conceal. It was the only humane thing about the entire operation. You saw him, Adrian continued, his voice low. You saw Samuel's intelligence. He can process music as mathematical sequence. He can read Braille at a frightening speed, but he has no friends. He has no normal interaction, and every specialist I hire sees a paycheck or a project. They speak to him in that maddeningly slow, soft voice, dripping with pity. They do not see a 10-year-old boy who needs someone to teach him how to play, not how to perform. Adrian finally sat down, folding his hands on the desk. His eyes, usually cold, held a weary intensity. Your qualification is simple. You were honest with him. You admitted you were intimidated by this place, and he appreciated that honesty. I need you to understand the gravity of your role. You are not just a tutor. You are a buffer. You shield him from this house, from my business, and from the people who will inevitably try to use him against me. Natalia leaned forward. And my daughter? You guaranteed her security. What does that entail exactly? Is she a bargaining chip? Adrian looked genuinely insulted by the question, though Natalia couldn't tell if it was professional or paternal offense. Miss Bassi, my contracts are my honor. Your daughter, Tulip, will live in an executive condominium in the Cypress Hill district. The title will be transferred to a holding trust in her name. It has 3 layers of private security, separate from this estate's network. She will have a dedicated, certified nanny, paid by me, available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. She will attend the finest private school I can arrange. He paused, letting the scope of the offer sink in. If she is ever compromised, or if you feel her security is remotely at risk due to my affairs, you have a panic button on the emergency line. I will personally arrange her disappearance and relocation to a safe international location with a new identity, and you will follow. That is not a threat. That is the non-negotiable term of your employment. Your daughter is shielded. She is untouchable. The sheer, overwhelming scope of the security, the kind of security only someone with Adrian Zane's resources could provide, was paralyzing. It was the complete eradication of every single anxiety she had ever faced as a single mother. This is too much money for what you are asking, Natalia said, her voice shaking slightly as she looked at the revised contract figure again. No, Adrian countered firmly. It is the minimum necessary to ensure you never have to worry about rent, utilities, or the cost of a purple coloring book again. It is the cost of my son's genuine human connection. I do not bargain over that. He then pushed a single sheet of paper toward her. This is the non-disclosure agreement for your daughter's security detail. You sign this, and your old life, your money troubles, and your fear of poverty disappear. The trade-off is your absolute loyalty to Samuel's well-being." Natalia looked at the contract, then at the pen, heavy, silver, and perfectly balanced, lying next to it. Her hand trembled, not from fear of Adrian Zane, but from the terrifying finality of the decision. She was about to trade her honest, though exhausting life for a life of guarded, gilded security. "What if you ask me to do something illegal?" The question echoed in her mind. She recalled Adrian's earlier answer. "Your loyalty is to Samuel. If I ever asked you to do anything that would harm him, you would refuse. If you refuse, you keep your job. If you refuse because you fear me, then you are useless to Samuel, and I will dismiss you. Your only duty is to the boy." The twisted logic was chillingly effective. It meant her moral compass had to be pointed solely at Samuel. As long as she protected him, physically and emotionally, she was safe. The moment she betrayed that duty, or let her fear of Adrian influence her care for Samuel, the contract was worthless. She thought of Tulip, who deserved to grow up in a safe, spacious home without the constant, draining pressure of eviction notices and late fees. Tulip, who could have a nanny and a secure school environment, protected by a firewall of men and money. She could give Tulip a childhood free from the shadows of her mother's poverty. It was the ultimate sacrifice and the ultimate gift. She thought of Samuel counting the beat in the silent ballroom, his small, isolated joy when she asked him to dance. He was a prisoner of his father's power and his own condition. He needed someone brave enough to ignore the money and see the boy. Natalia closed her eyes briefly, breathing in the scent of aged leather and the cold ocean air. She wasn't just signing a job contract. She was signing a covenant with her own conscience. She would shield Samuel, and Adrian Zane would shield Tulip. The overwhelming luxury and the suffocating security of the Anchor estate represented a peace she had never known, purchased with a moral debt she could never fully repay. Natalia picked up the silver pen. The weight felt symbolic, the weight of her new fate. She was trading one kind of confinement for another, the small economic prison of poverty for the massive physical prison of the Anchor estate. "I accept," she said, her voice firm, the tremor finally gone. She signed the contract, then the ancillary security agreement for Tulip, her signature bold and clear. As soon as the ink dried, Adrian Zane relaxed, the slightest tension easing from his shoulders. It was a minuscule change, but in a man so controlled, it spoke volumes. He stood up, towering over the desk. He did not smile, but his eyes held something that bordered on relief. "Good," he said. "Welcome to the Anchor estate, Natalia. Your loyalty to Samuel begins now. Your first day is tomorrow, 10 a.m. sharp. I have instructed my head of security, Victor, to arrange your immediate transition. He will ensure you and your daughter's new, secure arrangements are handled before dawn. You will never have to step back into your old apartment." He extended a hand. It was a massive, powerful hand, yet the grip was surprisingly gentle, a formal acknowledgement of the new alliance. Natalia shook it, feeling the unyielding resolve of the man. "Andre will take you back now. Victor will be in touch with the details for tomorrow morning." Natalia stood, gripping her old worn handbag, which now felt laughably out of place. The reality of her decision had settled, cold and sharp. She had just sold her soul, not to the devil, but to a desperate father. She had a new life, a secure future for Tulip, and a terrifying, unblinking connection to the most powerful and feared man in the city. The dangerous game had officially begun. and she was now one of Adrian Zane's carefully guarded assets. She was officially tethered to the Anchor estate. She only hoped that the shield Adrian promised would hold for both her and Tulip. The dawn broke over Harbor City, but for Natalia, the morning felt less like a sunrise and more like the start of a deep-sea dive. She had signed the contract only hours ago, yet the change in her life was already a tidal wave, rushing in with impossible speed. The weight of the silver pen, the pen she had used to sign her new fate, still felt heavy on her fingers. She was now an employee of Adrian Zane. She was a guardian to his son. She had exchanged the predictable anxieties of poverty for the volatile anxieties of power. She woke Tulip up earlier than usual, the small task of dressing her daughter feeling like a farewell ritual to their old life. The air in the studio apartment, which had always smelled faintly of burnt toast and hopeful persistence, now felt stifling, inadequate. At exactly 7:30 a.m., as stipulated by the single text message she received from the new handler, Victor, a gentle knock came at the door. It wasn't the sharp, demanding sound of a landlord, but a respectful, measured rhythm. Natalia opened the door to find two figures. The first was Victor, Adrian Zane's head of security, whom Adrian had mentioned in the library. He was not as massive as André, the driver, but he possessed a different kind of strength, radiating competence and silent authority. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit and carried a small, sealed, unmarked briefcase. The second person was a smartly dressed woman in a uniform, holding a large, expensive-looking toy unicorn. Victor stepped into the room, his eyes performing an immediate, sweeping assessment of the space, noting the stacked moving boxes, the small kitchenette, and Tulip, who was hiding shyly behind Natalia's legs, clutching a worn-out flannel blanket. "Miss Bassi, I am Victor. This is Sarah. She is assigned to Tulip's care during the transition. We are entirely on schedule," Victor stated, his voice calm, clipped, and completely professional. He offered no greeting, only information. "The apartment is secured. The truck is downstairs. You have 20 minutes to confirm all personal belongings are prepared." Natalia stared at the unicorn, then at the sealed briefcase. The speed and efficiency were staggering. I haven't even packed Tulip's toothbrush yet." "Sarah will assist with the final packing of essentials. The secure apartment is fully furnished, including a dedicated playroom. The priority now is speed and discretion," Victor explained, opening the briefcase on her tiny, wobbly dining table. Inside, there was not a gun, but a small, secured tablet and a stack of legal documents. "Your new residence is now under your name, paid in full via the Secure Housing Fund. It is located 12 minutes from the Anchor estate. It possesses 3 layers of access control, a dedicated emergency communication line, and an assigned rotating security presence." Natalia felt a dizzying pressure behind her eyes. It was not a rental. It was hers. A gift of security so profound it felt like a trap. Victor noticed her frozen expression. "Mr. Zane ensures his people do not suffer unnecessary distraction. Your financial stability is now non-negotiable. Please focus on your daughter." Tulip, meanwhile, had crept forward, drawn by the beautiful unicorn. Sarah knelt down, talking to Tulip in a soft, musical voice, distracting her completely from the men in dark suits. Tulip giggled, forgetting about the impending change. Natalia quickly signed the final transfer documents Victor indicated, her signature feeling insignificant against the sheer weight of the transaction. Within minutes, her small life was boxed up by Victor's silent, efficient crew, loaded onto an unmarked white truck, and gone. Victor drove Natalia and Tulip in a second, identical black SUV. The vehicle was equipped with polarized glass, insulating them from the world outside. The sense of isolation was absolute. "Your new residence is in the Cypress Hill district. It is a 3-bedroom condominium," Victor said, without taking his eyes from the road. You have a contact list programmed into the emergency phone inside. Only use those numbers. Any unauthorized contact or deviation from established security protocols will be viewed as a breach of Clause 4B of your contract, not because we doubt your loyalty, but because the outside world will test the weakest link, which is your visibility. Natalia nodded, her throat dry. I understand. Tulip is never to know about Mr. Zane's other work. Of course, Victor replied. For Tulip, her mother has accepted a highly paid position as a private educator to a wealthy, reclusive family. That is the only truth she or anyone outside the estate needs to know. They pulled up to a beautifully manicured, exclusive building. The lobby was minimalist and secure, the staff utterly silent and discreet. The condominium itself was stunning, spacious, bright, overlooking a park, furnished with exquisite taste, and featuring a room decorated just for Tulip, complete with the unicorn and a giant purple coloring book. Tulip's shriek of pure joy when she saw her new room broke the tension. Natalia watched her daughter, seeing the innocent delight transform her small face, and felt the iron certainty of her decision harden. This security, this peace, was worth the price of her own fear. I must leave now, Miss Bassi. Mr. Zane requires your presence at the estate at 10 Hontwak a.m. sharp. Andre will return for you at 9:30 a.m., Victor said, handing her a keycard. Enjoy the security. Victor left, and Natalia was alone, surrounded by staggering luxury, yet feeling more trapped than she had in her cramped studio. At 9:30 a.m., the matte black SUV returned. Natalia had dressed with extra care, choosing a simple, conservative navy dress. She kissed Tulip goodbye, leaving her in the care of Sarah, a woman who seemed as comforting and reliable as the new walls around them. The drive to the Anchor estate felt longer and more isolating than the first time. The final approach to the fortress was a series of automated checkpoints, each gate opening and closing with unnerving precision. As they passed the last checkpoint, the full magnitude of the estate became visible. It wasn't just a house, it was an architectural statement of defiance, all hard lines and dark glass set against the furious blue of the Pacific. Andre stopped the car, not at the grand entrance, but at a discreet side door leading into what felt like the service wing. Wait here, Andre instructed. He was back in seconds, guiding her down a wide but sterile corridor. The Anchor estate operates on a strict clock, Andre explained softly. Mr. Zane values efficiency and silence. You will interact with 3 core staff members regularly: Victor, head of security, the head of house, Ms. Petrov, and the estate chef, Marcus. They are your points of contact. You will not deviate from Samuel's designated wing unless escorted. He led her to a massive, beautifully paneled door. Mr. Zane is in the study waiting. Ms. Petrov will meet you shortly. Natalia took a deep breath, smoothing her dress, and stepped into the room. The study was less a working office and more a command center, filled with dark wood, minimalist furniture, and a bank of monitors showing complex stock tickers and weather patterns, not security footage. Adrian Zane was there, standing over a table covered in oversized topographic maps. He looked up, acknowledging her with a nod. Natalia, punctual, good. Is your daughter settled? Yes, sir. Thank you. The arrangements were far more comprehensive than expected. I ensure my debts are paid and my contracts are honored. You are here for Samuel. That is the only contract that matters now. Adrian set a hand on the map. I want to be clear about the environment before you begin. The Anchor estate is not a sanctuary. It is a shield. Outside these walls, my enemies look for weakness. Samuel is my only vulnerability. You are now his primary protective layer. That means you are bound by rules that protect the house, the boy, and yourself. Adrian stepped away from the maps, walking toward her. Rule number 1. You never discuss what you see, hear, or read here. Not with Tulip, not with your mother, not with anyone. The house is silent. I understand the confidentiality clause, Mr. Zane. Rule number 2. Samuel's routine is rigid. He thrives on consistency. His school day runs from 10 o'clock a.m. to 3 o'clock p.m. You will break that up with physical activity and sensory exploration, but the structure is firm. He eats lunch at 1 o'clock p.m. sharp, prepared by Marcus, who adheres to Samuel's exact nutritional plan. And rule number 3 is why you are here, Adrian continued, his voice lowering, the intensity returning. You will not treat him like a patient. You will not treat him like a project. You will treat him like a child who is merely navigating the world without light. Give him honesty, not pity. Give him challenge, not sympathy. His previous specialists failed because they saw his condition, not his potential. As if on cue, a tall woman with severe silver hair and a crisp black suit entered the room without knocking. This was Miss Petrov, the head of house. She carried a tablet and viewed Natalia with a single sharp, assessing look that felt colder than Victor's security scan. Ms. Bassi, I am Ms. Petrov. I run this estate. You are here to serve Samuel Zane, and only Samuel Zane. My job is to ensure you have everything required for his schedule. Your duties begin in the sensory wing. He is waiting. Miss Petrov handed Adrian Zane the tablet. The boy is currently in the sound chamber, listening to the new acquisition, Mr. Zane. Adrian nodded. Very well. Natalia, you may proceed. Ms. Petrov will guide you. Adrian Zane didn't say goodbye, only turned back to his maps, already fully immersed in his other darker world. Ms. Petrov led Natalia through a series of immaculate halls, each turn feeling more remote than the last. The Anchor estate was labyrinthine, built for privacy and efficiency, not comfort. The sensory wing is Samuel's designated learning area, Ms. Petrov explained, her voice devoid of inflection. It is soundproofed and temperature-controlled. He spends his days here when not engaged in physical therapy or music instruction. I have prepared your intake notes. She handed Natalia a small, spiral-bound notepad. It contained Samuel's daily schedule, a list of known food sensitivities, and a frighteningly detailed psychological profile from his former tutors, listing his challenges and defensive behavioral patterns. Natalia quickly folded the booklet and tucked it into her pocket, resolving to ignore the cold, clinical assessment. They stopped before a thick, soundproof door. Ms. Petrov gave a single, almost imperceptible nod to a guard standing nearby, who opened the door to reveal the sound chamber. It was a large, windowless room, carpeted wall to wall. Instead of furniture, the room was filled with carefully placed sound diffusers and acoustic panels. In the center, Samuel sat cross-legged on a velvet cushion, wearing large over-ear headphones. He was entirely still, his slight body rigid with concentration. The room itself was silent, but Natalia could feel the vibrations of the music through the floor. Samuel was so absorbed that he didn't notice their entry. Ms. Petrov remained at the door. You have exactly 1 hour for your first session, Miss Bassi. The goal for today, according to the previous plan, was the memorization of 2 historical figures through auditory flashcards. I will return at 11 o'clock a.m. She closed the door behind Natalia, the heavy lock clicking with a definitive, final sound. Natalia walked quietly toward Samuel, the lush carpeting muffling her steps. She knelt down beside him, not touching him, but making her presence known by a soft, steady exhale. Samuel pulled the headphones off one ear, a look of focused annoyance on his face. The acoustic separation is imperfect, he stated. not greeting her, but simply continuing his observation. "I detect a shift in air pressure and a new scent, lavender, and something metallic. That means you are new." Natalia smiled, impressed by his hyper-awareness. "You're absolutely right, Samuel. I am Natalia, and I am the new companion, and the metallic smell is probably just my fear mixing with the clean air of this very fancy room." That comment caused Samuel to pause. He took his hand away from the headphones. "Fear?" "Yes. This is a very big, silent house, and you are a very important boy. It's a little intimidating," Natalia admitted, settling onto the floor, pulling her skirt around her knees. "Pity is the customary response," Samuel countered, followed by overly loud, slow speaking. "You have used neither." "Well, I'm not a specialist. I'm just a mom who happens to think you're a very interesting person," Natalia said simply. She looked at the giant, expensive headphones. "What are you listening to? It makes the floor hum." "It is the Brahms Fourth Symphony, second movement. I am counting the string repeats in the A minor key. It is complex. My previous companion insisted I listen to biographies of historical figures, which are inefficient." "That sounds exhausting and boring," Natalia agreed. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded specialist report, then immediately pulled out the purple ribbon she had tied around Tulip's braid that morning. She placed the ribbon into Samuel's hand. The sensory wing, usually a monument to acoustic perfection, had been transformed. Natalia had spent the first 2 hours of the morning session doing something entirely outside of Samuel's meticulously planned curriculum. She was making a beautiful mess. She had cleared a corner of the sound chamber, dragging in soft, thick playmats, normally reserved for physical therapy, and covered them with a vast selection of unusual materials. The air, usually pristine and ozone-tinged, now carried a faint, pleasant scent of freshly cut pine needles and clean felt. Samuel sat cross-legged amidst the chaos, his hands resting lightly on the velvet cushion, his head tilted. He was radiating intense, controlled curiosity, a far cry from the stiff protocol of his previous sessions. "The room's volumetric resonance has degraded by 4.7%, Samuel observed precisely, his voice still low but lacking the clinical edge of his earlier sessions. "I perceive the introduction of fibrous polymers, some organic resins, and a low, pleasant rustling texture." Natalia laughed, a bright, genuine sound that felt rebellious in the silent fortress. She was beginning to understand that Samuel didn't need complexity. He needed novelty. He needed things that were imperfect, messy, and real. "That fibrous polymer is a box of soft wool yarn, Samuel, and the organic resins are just dried leaves I begged the grounds crew for," Natalia explained, running her fingers through a pile of smooth, polished river stones. "We are not memorizing historical dates today, and we are not mapping the Brahms. We are building a sound garden." Samuel's brow furrowed slightly in intellectual confusion, a gesture that Natalia found endearingly childlike. "A garden implies photosynthesis and water consumption. A sound implies vibration. The two concepts are incompatible." "Not in our garden," Natalia countered, her tone conspiratorial. She moved closer and gently placed his hand on a bed of finely crushed glass pebbles, the kind used for aquarium decoration, which made a delightful, whispery sound when disturbed. "This garden is grown with imagination and sound, not sunlight," she explained softly. "The goal is to map the concept of gentle noise. You are an expert in silence and volume. Today we explore the language of quiet textures. We are collecting sounds that are too small for the engineers to eliminate." Samuel's fingers, usually reserved for braille texts or piano keys, hesitantly explored the pebbles. He shifted them, producing a tiny crystalline sift of sound. His eyes, though unseeing, seemed to focus inward, mapping the sensation. It is brittle, cool, and creates a high-frequency scatter pattern, he summarized. But this time, he wasn't correcting her. He was describing his joy. Natalia pulled over a large, shallow wooden box and filled one quadrant with dried, crunchy autumn leaves she had collected the day before. The second quadrant she filled with smooth, heavy, cold beach sand. "Now, feel this," she prompted, guiding his hand to the dry leaves. Samuel pressed down. The leaves crumpled with a sharp, satisfying crackle. He repeated the motion, a tiny, involuntary smile playing on his lips. "It is the sound of fragility, the sound of something ending." "And now the sand," Natalia instructed, placing his hand in the cool, dense grains. Samuel moved the sand, producing a soft, low swoosh. "This is heavy and slow, the sound of weight, of reluctance." They spent the next hour meticulously exploring the different textures and the quiet noises they created. The low thump of felt against wood, the high, sweet chime of small ceramic bells threaded onto yarn, the deep thrum of a rubber band stretched over a small wooden bowl. Natalia focused on giving him the emotional context for the sounds, turning the exercise into a conversation about feeling rather than physics. "The wool yarn," Natalia mused, guiding his hand to the soft fibers. "It feels like a warm hug, doesn't it? It has no sharp sound, only quiet comfort." Samuel held the yarn, running it between his fingers. A hug is a compressive force applied for emotional assurance. This material is soft. It is the color of the silence just before sleep. Natalia reached out and gave his shoulder a quick, gentle squeeze. "That was a hug, Samuel. The kind that doesn't require silence, just a soft thought." He absorbed the touch without flinching, a significant step forward from his previous guarded resistance. As they worked, meticulously arranging the materials into their garden, a sensory topography of quiet noise, Natalia decided to introduce the concept of her daughter. It was an essential part of making herself fully human to him. "I have a daughter, Samuel," Natalia said, her voice dropping to a conversational murmur as they arranged the river stones into a winding path. "Her name is Tulip. She is 5, and she is extremely fond of loud noise, especially when she's wearing rain boots and jumping in puddles." Samuel stopped working, his head tilting again, analyzing the new data point. Tulip, a flowering plant known for rigidity and verticality. "Is the name symbolic of her disposition?" Natalia chuckled. "No, it's just a pretty name. But her disposition is definitely more loud puddle jump than rigid verticality. She has a very bright, very high-pitched laugh." "A high-pitched acoustic signature," Samuel mused. "Is she aware of the Anchor estate? Does she know about my condition?" "She knows I have a very important, wonderful job helping a great boy learn," Natalia said, choosing her words carefully, adhering to the script while giving Samuel full dignity. "She knows you like music, and she knows you are very special. She often asks me if you play with Legos." "Legos," Samuel repeated, sounding out the foreign concept. Small, interlocking plastic units designed for structural engineering, resulting in predictable geometric constructs. "Is that a common childhood recreation?" "It's a very common form of chaotic play. You build something perfect, and then you smash it. It's loud, messy, and excellent for frustration relief," Natalia explained. "Maybe one day, if Father allows it, Tulip could teach you how to smash a construct. She's an expert smasher." The thought seemed to genuinely delight Samuel, who paused his tactile work to consider the mathematical impossibility of smashing a predictable construct. The very concept was so deliciously contrary to the Anchor estate's ethos that it seemed to give him immense, silent amusement. The introduction of chaotic play into my schedule would violate 5 major subclauses of the current educational plan," Samuel recited, a subtle hint of rebellion in his tone. "But the concept of a smashing expert is compelling." Natalia smiled, realizing that the sound garden was less about the materials and more about giving Samuel permission to be silly, to explore the world outside of numbers and protocol. This was the real work, cultivating the boy beneath the prodigy. She was suddenly overwhelmed by the intense, controlled loneliness that permeated Samuel's life. The sterile luxury, the silence, the sheer magnitude of his father's protection, it was all designed to keep the world out, but in doing so, it kept joy out too. "Samuel," Natalia said, gently taking his hand away from the river stones, "the lesson is done for now. I think we need a break from serious sounds." "But the time block allocated for sensory integration is not yet completed," he argued instinctively. "I'm overriding the time block," Natalia said firmly. "I'm your companion. That means sometimes I follow the rules, and sometimes I follow my instincts. And my instinct says, you need to hear a silly story." Natalia took him out of the sound chamber and into his adjacent reading room. The room, like everything else, was luxurious but functional. She led him to a large plush chaise lounge. She didn't sit him on the cushion. Instead, she gently guided him to sit next to her, leaning slightly against her side, a shared contact that was both comforting and professional. It was the softest boundary she had allowed yet. She pulled out a simple, battered paperback book from her own worn handbag, a relic of her past life, a silly story about a confused cat that Tulip loved. It was utterly inappropriate for the genius son of Adrian Zane. "This is the cat who couldn't meow," Natalia announced, opening the book. The pages were slightly dog-eared, the binding cracked, imperfections that felt deliciously real in the Anchor estate. She began to read, not in the slow, modulated voice of a tutor, but in the energetic, expressive voice of a mother reading to her child. She used silly voices for the cat and the dog, and she exaggerated the sounds. And the cat tried. He tried to meow like a lion, which sounded like roar but muffled. And he tried to meow like a dolphin, which sounded like click, click, wee, wee. Samuel didn't laugh, but he didn't pull away. He listened with rapt attention, occasionally making a small, barely perceptible sound, a focused intake of breath, a tiny shift in posture that Natalia interpreted as pure, unadulterated enjoyment. He was absorbing the sheer ridiculousness of the language, the inefficiency of the sound choices, and the comforting sound of her voice. It was perhaps the first truly silly, pointless, and therefore truly human thing he had experienced in years. Just as Natalia reached the climax of the story, a soft, respectful cough announced the arrival of the estate chef, Marcus. He was a plump, gentle man, dressed in immaculate white, carrying a silver tray. He was the only staff member whose presence felt intrinsically warm. "Pardon the interruption, Ms. Bassie Samuel," Marcus said, his voice a quiet rumble. "Lunch is ready, but I wanted to bring Samuel his specific morning nutrient cocktail before the official seating. Mr. Zane insists on precision." Marcus placed a small chilled glass on the side table. Samuel, still leaning against Natalia, instinctively reached for it. "Did you enjoy the story, young master?" Marcus asked, his tone affectionate, bypassing the formal address that everyone else used. Samuel paused, holding the glass. "It was illogical, Chef Marcus. A cat is genetically predisposed to produce a meow sound. Its failure to do so indicates a neurological deficit or structural damage to the vocal cords. However, the performance was satisfyingly inefficient." Marcus chuckled, a low, kindly sound that reminded Natalia of Tulip's grandfather. "Well, sometimes inefficient things are the very best kind, Samuel. Enjoy your drink." Marcus withdrew as silently as he had arrived. Natalia watched Samuel take a slow, deliberate sip of the smoothie. She realized the Anchor estate was not devoid of humanity. It simply had a few pockets of it, hidden behind the walls of procedure and wealth. Marcus was one, and now she was another. "Natalia," Samuel said, replacing the glass on the coaster with perfect precision. The illogical cat story was, acoustically, far superior to the biographies of historical figures. I would like to hear it again tomorrow, during the scheduled quiet time block. It provides an excellent counterpoint to the severity of the Brahms. Natalia closed the worn paperback, the scent of the old pages a comforting presence. She gave his shoulder another gentle squeeze, lingering a moment longer this time. "It's a date, Samuel. We'll save the lion roar for tomorrow." He nodded, a slight, almost invisible bob of his head. It wasn't a professional agreement. It was an acknowledgement of their shared, sweet, and secret rebellion. In that moment, surrounded by the untouchable security of the Anchor estate, Natalia felt the first genuine flicker of happiness since she had accepted the job. She wasn't just working for Adrian Zane, she was caring for Samuel, and the terrifying price she had paid for Tulip's safety felt momentarily worth the gentle, illogical joy on Samuel's face. She was building the boy a garden of sound and light, one quiet texture at a time. The sound garden of yesterday had blossomed into something more profound than Natalia anticipated. It had become a shared space for defiance. This morning, as she entered the sensory wing at 10 o'clock a.m. sharp, Samuel was already waiting. He wasn't sitting rigidly on the velvet cushion, ready for the Brahms, but was instead standing by the wall, tracing a finger lightly over the acoustic panels. The gesture was less an exercise in texture and more an expression of impatient anticipation. His head tilted slightly, catching the precise moment the soundproof door side closed behind Natalia. "Good morning, Samuel," Natalia said, her voice warm and conversational. She crossed the room quickly, choosing a spot on the thick carpet near him. The room felt palpably different. Less sterile, more like a classroom where real learning, not rote performance, was about to take place. The faint, lingering scent of dried pine needles from the day before provided a subtle, earthy contrast to the room's usual ozone crispness. "Natalia," he replied, the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head serving as his greeting. The scheduled activity is the review of the Brahms counterpoint, followed by the silent reading block. However, I believe that the emotional counterpoint provided by the cat who couldn't meow is a more efficient use of the quiet time block immediately before lunch. His tone was formal, yet the underlying message was a perfectly coded request for their secret tradition. He was challenging the schedule before she even brought it up, testing the boundaries she had set yesterday. Natalia smiled, moving close enough that he could feel the slight shift in the air and smell the citrus hint of her hand lotion. "You are absolutely correct. The Brahms can wait for a few minutes. I brought the cat. But first, I have a different activity. It's an extension of the sound garden, but today we are going to use the sounds you already know to build a new skill." She knelt down and put her hand gently on his arm, guiding him away from the wall. "Yesterday, we explored the sound of small, close-up things, the crinkle of leaves, the sift of sand. Today, we map the sound of the large thing. The Anchor estate," Samuel stated, recognizing the shift in scale. "The architecture is primarily modernist, utilizing steel and marble, which results in a high reverb acoustic profile in the corridors. The sensory wing is specifically designed with extensive acoustic dampening, creating a near-zero reverberation index within this room. He paused, articulating the facts precisely. What is the objective of mapping the large thing? I know its dimensions from the architectural schematics provided by Father's security team. You know the numbers, Natalia countered softly, leading him back to the velvet cushion. But numbers don't help you if the fire alarm goes off, or if you lose your way, or if you need to find Marcus the chef for a chat. Your life here is built around silence and rigid paths. If you can't see, that silence and those paths can become a cage, even if they're gilded. She continued, leaning closer, making her voice a conspiratorial whisper. We are going to make an unseen map. Not a schematic of measurements, but a map made of echoes, texture, temperature, and staff movement. We are going to treat the Anchor estate not like a fortress, but like a massive, complex symphony that changes every hour. We will locate the true centers of activity and the true pockets of silence, the places where the surveillance is tightest, and the places that are simply forgotten. Samuel turned his head fully toward her, his expression a pure distillation of intense, focused curiosity. This was not a passive learning activity. It was a mission. It was giving him an active role in his own security and independence, a sense of control that she knew was essential to him. The process, Samuel began, his voice taking on the excited rhythm of a highly engaged student, would require the collection of variable data points, temperature shifts caused by proximity to the glass walls, the acoustic shadow created by large furnishings, the difference in texture between maintenance-grade carpet and the decorative marble flooring, and the cadence of the security personnel. Exactly, Natalia affirmed, giving his hand a quick squeeze. And we start here at the most controlled point. This room is zero echo, zero interference. We step outside, and the entire acoustic environment changes. Their first mission was a carefully orchestrated sound walk down the main gallery that led to the library. Natalia told Miss Petrov, the head of house, that they were conducting a spatial acoustic orientation exercise, a phrase so technical and official that the severe woman simply nodded and checked her timepiece without asking for details. They started just outside the sensory wing. Natalia gently guided Samuel's hand so it rested lightly on her elbow, a connection that allowed her to guide him without invading his space. "Ready, Professor Zane?" she murmured. "Engaging data collection," he replied, a tiny internal tremor of excitement barely audible in his voice. The first step was the floor. "Smooth, cold, high-gloss marble," Samuel stated, tapping his foot lightly. The vibration signature indicates solid, reinforced concrete beneath. Our footsteps create a 3-second reverb that echoes off the glass wall at the gallery's end. Natalia was astonished. She had only heard a heavy, echoing thump. Samuel heard a precise measurement. 3 seconds. Got it. That's our sonic landmark. She guided him forward slowly, past the abstract sculptures they had felt yesterday. She had him stop and run his hand along the velvet rope again. Rope, friction, sound absorption. This area is acoustically dead because the fabric breaks up the sound waves. A dead zone in the symphony, Samuel mused. A pause in the composition. As they moved, Natalia introduced non-structural landmarks. She had him listen to the faint, cyclical hiss of the air filtration system that was almost undetectable to her ears. Samuel instantly categorized it. That is the constant, low-frequency hum of the mechanical core. It is the keynote of the entire estate. If that changes, the entire composition is wrong. They reached the floor-to-ceiling glass wall that offered the terrifying view of the ocean. The environmental shift was immediate. "The air is colder here," Samuel noted, his hand resting on the chilled glass. "The sound is louder. It is not reverb. It is raw. It is the messy sound you described yesterday, the water, now amplified by the immense surface area of the glass. "That's our second landmark," Natalia said. "The ocean wall, cold, raw, loud. Now, let's find the third, the humans." They moved further down the gallery, and Natalia noticed the shift in sound, the distant, intermittent clatter of dinner preparation. It was faint, but clearly the sound of Marcus, the chef, working in the kitchen wing. "Listen, Samuel, can you place that sound?" Samuel focused intently. "I detect the use of stainless steel implements against a ceramic surface. The sound is muffled, suggesting heavy acoustic insulation between the service wing and the primary gallery. The low-frequency thudding suggests repetitive rhythmic food preparation. That is, Chef Marcus. He is a source of warmth in the composition." Natalia realized how much more Samuel was processing than a sighted person would. He wasn't just hearing sound, he was processing intent, temperature, and material composition. He was seeing the house with sound. They practiced identifying the distinct walking patterns of the staff, the silent, gliding walk of Ms. Petrov, always on time, always in leather soles, the heavy, measured boots of the security detail, always 2 steps apart, and the soft, rolling shuffle of Chef Marcus, which Samuel instantly associated with the scent of baked bread. Natalia had to stifle a laugh when Samuel accurately identified one of Adrian's bodyguards, Victor, approaching from 20 feet away, purely by the slight fractional delay in his gait caused by the weight of a concealed sidearm. "You are making a map of sound that is better than any visual schematic," Natalia whispered, genuinely in awe. "It is a necessity," Samuel replied, his expression serious. "Father built a house that is hostile to sight. I must translate it into a language I can use. You are providing the context for the composition. You have given the sound a purpose." Their concentrated exploration, however, was not unseen. The Anchor estate was a fortress, and its vigilance was absolute. As they circled back towards the study door, the precise moment Samuel used his new skills to predict the approach of an unseen staff member, a utility worker carrying a box, not a security guard. A cold, authoritative voice cut through the air. "Ms. Bassi, Samuel." They stopped immediately. Miss Petrov, the head of house, stood 50 feet away at the end of the corridor, her silver hair catching the ambient light. She looked utterly unimpressed. She wore a severe black suit, and her posture was a lesson in unyielding discipline. Her voice, when it spoke, was a low, controlled hum, like a machine running perfectly. "Your designated activity was the spatial acoustic orientation in the gallery," Ms. Petrov stated, gliding closer. "You have exceeded the time allowance by 12 minutes and have approached the private study door, which is outside the boundaries of the approved curriculum." Natalia stepped slightly in front of Samuel, a small, maternal shield. "My apologies, Miss Petrov. The exercise proved more valuable than anticipated. Samuel has exceptional aptitudes for oral mapping, and we were simply maximizing the learning outcome." Miss Petrov's gaze flickered to Samuel, then settled on Natalia, cold and assessing. "The learning outcome is measured by adherence to the schedule. Mr. Zane values efficiency. Deviation, Ms. Bassi, is a form of risk. Your current activity appears to be encouraging an unusual level of self-guided exploration. Samuel's life is structured for a reason. It is safer when it is predictable." "Predictability is important," Natalia agreed, meeting her stare calmly. "But independence is essential for his well-being. He is a boy, not a component in the security system. Understanding his environment is the most important lesson I can teach him right now." Samuel, sensing the tension, gently tapped Natalia's elbow. The head of house utilizes a passive-aggressive rhetorical style, Natalia. Her objective is to re-establish the primary hierarchy of the estate. Miss Petrov's face remained frozen, but a tiny, almost invisible muscle in her jaw tightened. The bluntness of Samuel's observation, delivered with the innocent confidence of a child stating a mathematical truth, momentarily diffused the confrontation. Regardless of the boy's commentary, "My directives are from Mr. Zane," Ms. Petrov continued, recovering instantly. "You have been instructed to provide companionship and structure. I suggest you adhere to the schedule's designated parameters for the remainder of the week, or I will be required to file a report regarding the efficacy of your methods." "Understood, Miss Petrov," Natalia said, her tone professional and cool. She would not back down, but she would not provoke a direct escalation either. "We will return to the sensory wing immediately. The rhythm block is next." Miss Petrov watched them until they were almost out of sight before turning and gliding away, disappearing down a service corridor. The entire exchange was a stark reminder that Natalia was not just a tutor. She was a variable that was being constantly monitored within a tightly controlled experiment. Her every deviation, even the smallest act of rebellious kindness, was being noted and judged. Back in the sensory wing, Natalia didn't start the rhythm block. She walked Samuel to the far corner of the room, away from the door, a corner where the dampening panels met the floor. "That was a warning," Natalia whispered, still slightly breathless from the confrontation. "She is correct," Samuel whispered back, his voice low. "Deviation increases probability of exposure. But predictability is also a vulnerability. Predictable patterns can be mapped and exploited by external factors, including people who work inside the house." He spoke not with fear, but with the chilling, detached logic of a security analyst. Natalia realized the truth. The rigidity of the schedule was his father's attempt to keep him safe, but it was also a straitjacket. She needed to teach him how to be unpredictable, how to move through the house like a ghost, known only to her. "The unseen map has to be complete," Natalia stated, her resolve hardening. "And the most important data point is the security cameras. You can't hear them, but they're everywhere, watching us right now." "There is an acoustic anomaly near the conservatory entrance," Samuel offered instantly, tapping his chin thoughtfully. "A shift in the airflow and a slight decrease in the ambient electrical hum. It is a junction point where the HVAC system creates a brief sound shadow. It is also the farthest point from the primary security desk." "A sound shadow. Could it also be a sight shadow?" Natalia mused. They spent the remainder of their session not in the sound garden, but mapping the coordinates of this proposed anomaly in their minds, using the constant hum of the estate as their baseline. The next day, Natalia bypassed the sound garden entirely. After a brief, required review of the Brahms, she led Samuel out of the wing, acting with the speed and certainty of a person who belonged there. Ms. Petrov was nowhere in sight, perhaps satisfied that they had returned to compliance. Natalia guided Samuel through the marble halls, past the ocean wall, and towards the far residential wing. She kept up a quiet, soothing stream of conversation, covering their footsteps and lending an air of casual purpose to their movement. She told him the rest of the story of the cat who couldn't meow, weaving the silly voices into the serious architecture of the fortress. Finally, they reached the proposed location, a wide archway leading into a brightly lit conservatory filled with exotic plants. "Stop," Samuel commanded softly, pulling his arm gently from hers. "It's here. The air is still. The electrical signature is weaker." Natalia slowly scanned the environment, focusing on the ceiling where the cameras were subtly recessed into the dark wood paneling. At the junction point of the archway, where the sound shadow was greatest, the ceiling panel was blank. It was an oversight, a tiny architectural flaw where the two security camera fields of vision failed to overlap for a crucial 2-meter span. "You found it, Samuel," Natalia whispered, her eyes wide with shock and triumph. "We are standing in the unseen. No eyes, no sound tracking." Samuel moved into the gap, standing perfectly still. He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. "It feels exposed and quiet, like being between two musical notes." In this forgotten pocket, Natalia noticed a small, narrow window, not a grand glass wall, but a discreet, utilitarian slit high up, likely placed for ventilation. It was too small to offer a view, but it was open an inch, letting in a thin, cold draft of fresh, unfiltered air and a very distant, very faint sound that was neither the ocean nor the house hum. She guided Samuel's hand up, letting him feel the cold, grainy rush of the outside air. "What is that sound?" Samuel asked, his voice barely a breath. Natalia listened, her ear close to the open window. It was the faint, high-pitched screech of a distant seagull, a small, chaotic cry of nature, utterly disconnected from the pristine luxury of the Anchor estate. "That," Natalia whispered, smiling at the simple, beautiful inefficiency of the noise, "is the sound of the world outside, the world that doesn't know about schedules or security protocols." In that moment of shared secret discovery, Samuel reached out, not for her hand, but for the purple ribbon she always kept tucked into her sleeve. He took it, held it, and tied it gently around his own wrist, tucking the loose ends into his sleeve so it couldn't be seen. "This ribbon is a reminder of the unseen map, Natalia," Samuel said, his voice low and firm, "and the cat who couldn't meow. This is our truth, hidden inside the fortress." Natalia felt a profound sense of commitment solidify. The Anchor estate was a dangerous prison, but together they were finding the quiet places, the forgotten corners, and the simple human truths within its walls. She wasn't just his companion. She was the architect of his independence, one brave, inefficient lesson at a time. The game had truly begun. The purple ribbon stayed hidden on Samuel's wrist for 3 weeks, a silent testament to their growing rebellion against the fortress's rigid protocols. Natalia had settled into a rhythm that felt almost sustainable. She arrived at the Anchor estate each morning at 9:30 a.m., spent her days building Samuel's unseen map, teaching him the language of independence through sound and texture, and returned to Tulip each evening with stories carefully sanitized of any truth about Adrian Zane's real world. The apartment in Cypress Hill had become a sanctuary, and the salary deposited into her account each week was more money than she had earned in entire years of waitressing. For a brief, fragile moment, Natalia allowed herself to believe that the dangerous bargain she had struck was manageable. That illusion shattered on a Tuesday morning when Victor, the head of security, met her at the service entrance instead of André. Victor's face, usually a mask of professional neutrality, was tight with barely concealed tension. His hand rested near his jacket in the way she had learned meant he was armed and alert. "Miss Bassi, there has been a development," Victor said, his voice clipped and low. "Mr. Zane requires your presence in the security wing before you begin with Samuel. It is not optional." The security wing was a part of the Anchor estate she had never seen, deliberately excluded from the polished tours and carefully managed interactions. Natalia's stomach tightened with cold dread as Victor led her down a narrow, utilitarian corridor far removed from the marble galleries and acoustic chambers. The walls here were concrete, the lighting harsh and fluorescent. This was the skeleton of the fortress, the place where Adrian Zane's real work happened. They stopped before a heavy steel door. Victor keyed in a code, and the lock released with a pneumatic hiss. Inside, the room was dominated by a wall of monitors displaying live feeds from every corner of the estate, and, she realized with growing horror, several locations throughout Harbor City. Adrian stood in the center of the room, his back to her, studying a particular screen with lethal focus. Two men she didn't recognize flanked him, their suits immaculate, their expressions unreadable. "Natalia," Adrian said without turning, "thank you for coming. I need you to see something. And I need you to understand the full scope of the protection I provide." He gestured to one of the monitors. The image showed the exterior of a modest building she recognized instantly. It was Tulip's preschool, the small, cheerful facility 3 blocks from their new apartment. The timestamp indicated the footage was from yesterday afternoon. Natalia's breath caught. "Why are you watching my daughter's school?" "Because 2 days ago, a man began watching it as well," Adrian replied, finally turning to face her. His expression was glacial, devoid of the faint warmth he sometimes showed when speaking about Samuel. This was Adrian Zane, the crime lord, not Adrian Zane, the father. "His name is Dmitry Volkov. He works for my primary competitor, Konstantin Rusov's. Rusov has been attempting to consolidate territory in Harbor City for the past 6 months. He has been, until now, an irritation. Yesterday, he became a threat." Victor stepped forward and tapped a key. The monitor switched to a different angle, zooming in on a man standing across the street from the preschool. He was tall, nondescript, dressed in a gray jacket, but his posture was wrong. He wasn't a parent. He was a predator, cataloging exits and routines. "We neutralized his surveillance operation within 4 hours of detection," Adrian continued, his voice cold and factual. "Dmitry Volkov is currently being questioned in a location far from here. He will not be returning to Harbor City. However, his presence confirms what I suspected. Rusov knows about you. He knows about Samuel. And he is probing for weaknesses." Natalia felt the room tilt slightly, the fluorescent lights suddenly too bright. "You said Tulip would be safe. You promised me she was untouchable." "She is," Adrian said, his voice hardening into absolute certainty. "Which is why Volkov is no longer a problem. But you need to understand, Natalia, that safety in my world is not passive. It is an active, constant war. I do not just build walls. I eliminate threats before they reach the walls. That is the reality of the protection you accepted when you signed the contract." One of the men standing beside Adrian stepped forward. He was older, his face weathered and scarred, and when he spoke his accent was thick and Eastern European. "Miss Bassi, my name is Gregor. I run external security for the Zane family. The threat level has escalated. We are implementing additional protocols. Your daughter will now have a dedicated armed escort during all school transports. You will no longer use your personal vehicle. All travel will be coordinated through our secure network." Natalia's mind raced, trying to process the suffocating layers of control being wrapped around her life. "This wasn't part of the agreement. You're turning my daughter into a prisoner." "I am turning your daughter into a priority asset," Adrian corrected, his tone allowing no argument. "Rusov's next move will be more aggressive. He does not play by the old rules. He will use any leverage he can find, and you, Natalia, are now visible. Your connection to Samuel makes you a target. I will not apologize for ensuring your survival." The cold, brutal logic was undeniable, but it felt like a trap closing around her throat. She had believed she could compartmentalize her life, keep Tulip separate from the darkness. But Adrian's world did not allow for separation. Everything she touched was now marked, monitored, and militarized. "What do you need from me?" Natalia asked, her voice barely steady. I need you to continue exactly as you have been, Adrian said, and for the first time, a flicker of something human crossed his face. Samuel's progress with you has been extraordinary. Miss Petrov's reports indicate he is more engaged, more confident, and for the first time in years, he is happy. That is irreplaceable. But I also need you to be vigilant. If you see anything unusual, anyone unfamiliar, any deviation in the routine, you report it immediately to Victor. You are not just Samuel's companion anymore. You are part of his security apparatus. Natalia nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She was no longer a waitress who had stumbled into a dangerous job. She was a component in a machine designed to protect a boy from a world that wanted to destroy him. The weight of that responsibility was crushing. Victor escorted her back to the main wing in silence. As they walked, Natalia's mind churned with the impossible calculus of her situation. She could walk away, trigger the emergency protocols Adrian had promised, and disappear with Tulip into a new life with a new identity. But that would mean abandoning Samuel, leaving him alone in the fortress with only the cold efficiency of his father's protection. The thought of his small, hopeful face, the way he had tied her purple ribbon around his wrist as a symbol of their shared rebellion, made the idea unbearable. She found Samuel in the sensory wing, sitting cross-legged on the velvet cushion, his fingers tracing the edges of a Braille music score. He looked up the moment she entered, his head tilting in that familiar, assessing way. "You are late by 4 minutes, Natalia," Samuel observed, "and your respiratory pattern is elevated. Your scent profile indicates stress, specifically the cortisol-laden perspiration associated with acute fear. Did something happen?" Natalia knelt beside him, forcing her breathing to slow, her professional mask slipping back into place. "Just a meeting with your father, Samuel. Nothing for you to worry about." "Father's meetings in the security wing are never insignificant," Samuel replied, his voice quiet but insistent. "He only uses that location when there is an external threat to the estate or to me. Is someone trying to hurt me again?" The word "again" hung in the air like a landmine. Natalia realized, with a sharp pang of sorrow, that this was not the first time Samuel had been the target of his father's enemies. His entire life had been a series of escalating security measures, each one a response to some past danger. "Your father is very good at keeping you safe, Samuel," Natalia said gently. "And so am I. That's my job. But yes, there are people in the world who don't like your father very much, and sometimes they make bad decisions. Your father is handling it." Samuel absorbed this with the same focused intensity he applied to mapping sound. He reached out and found her hand, his fingers cool and steady. "If the bad decisions reach you or Tulip, you will leave. You will use the emergency protocol. Father built it for a reason. You are not required to be a martyr for my companionship." The blunt, compassionate logic of a 10-year-old boy who had spent his entire life being protected by violence nearly broke her. Natalia squeezed his hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere, Samuel. We still have a lot of work to do on the unseen map, and I believe you owe me a very detailed analysis of why the confused cat is superior to Brahms." Samuel's expression softened, the faint ghost of a smile touching his lips. "The cat is not superior, it is complementary. Brahms provides structural complexity. The cat provides emotional inefficiency, and both are necessary for a complete understanding of the world." They spent the rest of the session in the sound garden, but Natalia's mind was divided. Part of her focused on Samuel's careful exploration of a new texture, a length of cool, smooth silk, and part of her scanning every sound in the hallway beyond the soundproof door, listening for the footsteps of threats she couldn't see. The fragile peace lasted exactly 9 days. Natalia was in the middle of reading Samuel another story This one about a dog who couldn't bark, when her phone vibrated with the specific sharp pattern that indicated an emergency message from Victor. Her blood turned to ice. She glanced at the screen. The message was brief and devastatingly clear. Secure Samuel. Lockdown protocol active. Threat inbound. Stay in sensory wing. Armed escort en route. Samuel, attuned to the shift in her breathing and the sudden sharp scent of her fear, immediately stopped listening to the story. Natalia, what is the message? We need to stay here, Samuel, Natalia said, her voice calm but firm, every maternal instinct screaming at her to protect the boy. Your father has activated a security protocol. We're safest in this room. The soundproof door, which had always felt like a cocoon, now felt like a trap. Natalia moved quickly, positioning herself between Samuel and the door, her mind racing through the layout of the estate, calculating escape routes she had mapped during their secret explorations. The sensory wing had one entrance and no windows. It was a dead end. The lights in the room flickered once, then the backup generator kicked in, bathing the space in a cold emergency blue. The sound-dampening panels, designed to create silence, now amplified her heartbeat into a deafening drum. 3 minutes passed, then 5. The silence was unbearable. Finally, the door's lock disengaged with a heavy click, and Victor stepped inside, flanked by 2 armed men. His face was grim, and there was a fresh bruise darkening his jaw. Behind them, Natalia caught a brief, terrifying glimpse of the hallway. The pristine marble floor was scuffed, and she smelled something acrid and wrong, gunpowder and fear. Miss Bassie, Samuel, you're both unharmed, Victor confirmed, his eyes scanning them with professional efficiency. The threat has been neutralized. Mr. Zane is securing the perimeter. You will remain here for another 30 minutes. Then I will escort you both to the reinforced safe room in the residential wing. What happened? Natalia demanded, her voice shaking despite her efforts to control it. Rusov sent a team, 4 men. They breached the outer gate using a stolen access code, Victor said, his tone clipped and factual, the voice of a soldier delivering a casualty report. They made it as far as the main gallery before we intercepted. All 4 are in custody. No estate personnel were seriously injured. But Miss Bassie, this was a direct assault. This was not surveillance. This was an attempted extraction. Extraction, Samuel repeated, his voice small and tight. They were coming for me. Yes, Victor confirmed, offering the boy the respect of honesty. But they failed, and they will not try again. Mr. Zane is ensuring that. Natalia felt a cold, visceral terror unlike anything she had ever experienced. This was not an abstract threat on a security monitor. This was armed men invading the fortress, hunting for a 10-year-old boy, and she was standing in the center of it, holding his hand, utterly powerless. When Adrian finally came to the sensory wing an hour later, he looked like a man who had gone to war. His suit jacket was gone, his shirt sleeves rolled up, and there was a cold, lethal fury in his eyes that made the air around him feel volatile. He looked at Samuel first, his gaze sweeping over his son with a desperation that was quickly suppressed. Then his eyes locked onto Natalia. You did well, Adrian said, his voice rough. You kept him calm. You stayed in position. That is exactly what I needed. I didn't do anything, Natalia replied, her voice hollow. I just stood here, terrified. You stayed, Adrian corrected. When every instinct told you to run, you stayed with my son. That is worth more than you understand. He knelt down in front of Samuel, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. Samuel, the men who came here today will never come back. I have made certain of that. But I need you to understand that the world outside this house is dangerous, and it will always be dangerous. That is why I built these walls. That is why Natalia is here. Do you understand?" "Yes, Father," Samuel replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I understand that your business creates enemies, and those enemies use me as a weapon against you. I understand that I am both your greatest asset and your greatest vulnerability. Mr. Petrov explained this to me when I was 7. Adrian's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Natalia saw a flash of profound, devastating guilt cross his face. He pulled Samuel into a brief, fierce embrace, something she had never seen him do. When he released him, he stood and turned to Natalia. "I need to speak with you privately," Adrian said. It was not a request. He led her out of the sensory wing, down the corridor, and into his private study. The room felt different now, less like a command center and more like a confessional. Adrian poured himself a drink from a crystal decanter, his hands steady despite the violence of the past hour. "Rusov is no longer a problem," Adrian said quietly, staring into the amber liquid. "His operation in Harbor City has been dismantled. The 4 men he sent will not stand trial. They will simply disappear. That is the language of my world, Natalia. I do not call the police. I do not file lawsuits. I erase threats." "You killed them," Natalia whispered, the words feeling unreal even as she spoke them. "I protected my son," Adrian corrected, his voice hard. "And I protected you. That is the only moral calculus that matters to me. But I understand if that is unacceptable to you. I understand if you need to leave." Natalia stared at him, this man who had offered her security and wealth and had delivered exactly what he promised, brutal and absolute protection. She thought of Tulip, safe in the apartment, guarded by men willing to kill to keep her that way. She thought of Samuel, sitting alone in the sensory wing, mapping a world through sound because his father's enemies had stolen his sight of safety. "If I leave, what happens to Samuel?" Natalia asked. "I hire another companion, someone competent, well-vetted, and utterly replaceable," Adrian said. "Samuel will survive. He always does. But he will not thrive. He will go back to being the isolated, perfect, miserable boy he was before you asked him to dance." The choice was impossible, a decision between her own moral boundaries and the heart of a child who had finally learned to smile. Natalia felt the weight of it crushing her chest, the suffocating reality that there was no clean answer, no path that didn't require sacrifice. "I need time," Natalia said finally. "I need to think about this, about what I can live with." "You have 24 hours, Adrian replied. "After that, I need to know if you are part of this family or if you are a liability I need to carefully extract." Natalia didn't sleep that night. She sat in the pristine living room of the Cypress Hill apartment, watching Tulip sleep peacefully in her purple-themed bedroom, guarded by men whose faces she would never see. The weight of Adrian's ultimatum pressed down on her like a physical force. She could stay, accept the blood money and the brutal protection, and continue to give Samuel the companionship that had transformed his isolated life. Or she could trigger the emergency protocol, take Tulip, and disappear into a new identity, leaving behind the boy who had tied her purple ribbon around his wrist as a symbol of trust. Her phone sat on the coffee table, the emergency contact number programmed and waiting. One call, and Victor would initiate the extraction. Within hours, she and Tulip would be on a plane to a new city, a new country, a new life scrubbed clean of Adrian Zane's world. It was the safe choice, the moral choice, the choice any reasonable mother would make. But Natalia couldn't stop thinking about Samuel's voice, small and steady, saying, "You are not required to be a martyr for my companionship." He had given her permission to leave, to save herself, but he had also trusted her enough to show her his vulnerability, to let her into the fortress of his carefully controlled world. Leaving him felt like the worst kind of betrayal. At dawn, Natalia made her decision. She dressed carefully, putting on her best navy dress, and kissed Tulip goodbye. Sarah, the nanny, gave her a knowing, sympathetic look, but said nothing. The black SUV arrived precisely at 9:30 a.m., and Andre drove her to the Anchor estate in silence. Adrian was waiting in the library, standing before the massive glass wall overlooking the Pacific. He turned when she entered, his expression unreadable. "I'm staying," Natalia said before he could speak. "But I have conditions." Adrian's eyebrow raised slightly, the faintest flicker of surprise crossing his face. "You are in no position to negotiate, Natalia." "I'm in the only position that matters," Natalia countered, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. "I am the person Samuel trusts. You can replace me, but you can't replace what we've built. So yes, I have conditions." Adrian gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Speak." Natalia sat, gripping her hands tightly in her lap. "First, I will never be asked to participate in, witness, or cover up any act of violence. My role is Samuel and only Samuel. If your business touches my work with him, I walk, and I take him with me if I can." "Agreed," Adrian said immediately. "That was always the intent." "Second, Tulip remains completely insulated. She will never meet you. She will never come to this estate. She will never know the truth about who you are. The moment she is at risk, genuinely at risk, the emergency protocol is activated, and I don't ask your permission." Adrian considered this, his jaw tightening. "The emergency protocol is yours to trigger at any time. I will not interfere. But understand, Natalia, that activation is permanent. You do not come back." "I understand," Natalia said. "And third, Samuel gets a choice. When he is old enough, when he understands the full scope of his father's world, he gets to decide if he wants to stay in it or leave it. And if he chooses to leave, you let him go. You don't trap him in this fortress for your protection. You give him the freedom to walk away." The silence that followed was suffocating. Adrian's expression hardened into something cold and dangerous, the crime lord reasserting control. "You are asking me to give up my son. I'm asking you to love him enough to let him choose his own life," Natalia replied, her voice soft but unyielding. "Right now, he's a prisoner of your protection. I'm asking you to make him a person." Adrian turned away, staring out at the violent, churning sea. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Natalia wondered if she had pushed too far, if the ultimatum would snap the fragile alliance they had built. Finally, Adrian spoke, his voice low and rough. "When he is 18, he will be given the choice. I will provide him with the resources to disappear if that is what he wants. But until then, he stays here, under my protection. Those are my terms." "Agreed," Natalia said, relief flooding through her. Adrian turned back to face her, and for the first time she saw something raw and unguarded in his eyes. "You are a dangerous woman, Natalia Bassi. You make me believe that there is something in this world worth protecting beyond power and territory. That is a weakness I cannot afford." "Then it's a good thing I'm not your enemy," Natalia replied. "No," Adrian agreed, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "You are something far more terrifying. You are my son's hope." Natalia returned to the sensory wing, where Samuel was waiting, sitting on the velvet cushion, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He turned his head the moment she entered, his expression tight with worry. "You came back," Samuel said, his voice barely a whisper. "Of course I did," Natalia replied, kneeling beside him. "We still have half of the unseen map to complete. and I believe you owe me a full acoustic analysis of the conservatory during a rainstorm." Samuel reached out and found her hand, gripping it tightly. "Natalia, if staying here puts you in danger, if it puts Tulip in danger, you have to leave. I can survive without you. I survived before." "You survived," Natalia agreed gently. "But you weren't living, Samuel. You were just existing in the silence. And I didn't come here to help you survive. I came here to help you live." She pulled the purple ribbon from her sleeve, the one he had returned to her after the lockdown, and tied it gently around his wrist again. "This is our promise, Samuel. I stay, you stay brave, and together we make this fortress a little less lonely. Deal?" "Deal," Samuel whispered. And for the first time since the attack, he smiled. The weeks that followed were a delicate, fragile peace. The Anchor estate remained a fortress, the security protocols tighter than ever. But within the walls, Natalia and Samuel continued their quiet rebellion. They completed the unseen map, charting every sound shadow and forgotten corner. They read ridiculous stories about confused animals. They built a second sound garden in the conservatory, this one featuring the distant, chaotic calls of seagulls and the irregular patter of rain on glass. Adrian watched from a distance, his presence a constant, protective shadow. He never interfered with Natalia's methods, never questioned her curriculum. But sometimes, late in the afternoon, she would catch him standing in the hallway outside the sensory wing, listening to the sound of his son's laughter, a sound so rare and precious it seemed to justify every terrible thing he had ever done. Natalia had made her choice. She had chosen to stay in the dangerous, gilded cage, to accept the blood money and the brutal protection, because a 10-year-old boy had trusted her enough to tie a purple ribbon around his wrist. It was not a perfect choice, not a clean choice, but it was hers. And in the cold, silent fortress of the Anchor estate, amidst the violence and the wealth and the fear, she had found something unexpected, a purpose worth the price. She was no longer a waitress invisible in the background of other people's glamorous lives. She was Natalia Bassi, companion to Samuel Zane, guardian of his independence, and the one person in Adrian Zane's terrifying world who dared to demand that love be stronger than power. And for now, in this impossible, dangerous life, that was enough. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of this incredible journey. If this story touched your heart, wait until you see what's coming next. It's even more powerful and inspiring than you can imagine. So don't go anywhere. Click on that video showing on your screen right now to dive into another amazing story that will absolutely blow your mind. Trust me, you won't regret it.